Hi, and thanks for joining me for another session of the 2020 Organic Crops Field Tour. In this session, I'm going to be talking about organic grape disease management. Before I get started, talking about some of the specific diseases you'd expect to see in Tennessee and ways we can think about managing those organically, I just want to point out that grapes can be a really good crop for us in Tennessee, but they can also be very challenging. And so generally speaking, they're going to require pretty diligent care and maintenance, and that's especially true in an organic cropping system where we don't have access to the sort of full suite of pesticides that a conventional grower would. And so I'm going to provide some ideas on cultural practices that organic grape producers really need to focus on in order to have success growing grapes here in Tennessee. And you can see from these images, this is not what you'd hope a grape crop would look like, but unfortunately we do have some pretty high disease pressure here. We have an environment in Tennessee that's very favorable for a lot of diseases, including some of those we see here, black rot and downy mildew in particular. We'll talk about that a little bit too. But really, organic grape producers need to keep sort of four general areas or cultural practices in mind, and they really need to focus on them heavily in order to have success growing grapes here in Tennessee. And those cultural practices include site selection, variety selection, canopy management, and sanitation. And each of these will kind of influence disease susceptibility or the environment for diseases in slightly different ways. So thinking about site selection, the goal here from a disease management perspective is really to encourage air movement and air drainage out of the vineyard. What you don't want is very humid, stagnant air just kind of settling and creating a very favorable or wet or humid microclimate for diseases to develop. So that one way to get around that is through careful site selection. Next, variety selection. So there are a lot of grape varieties with good disease resistance, but again, some will have generally be much more susceptible to important diseases. And so this is one of those steps that a grower can take before the grapes go in the ground. So that's site selection, variety selection, things you do before you even begin growing grapes that can really impact how diseases are managed throughout the lifetime of the vineyard. And so careful attention needs to be paid to those issues before the vineyard is established. And once it is, you have to think about canopy management. And the goal here is, again, to encourage air movement. You want those leaves and the fruit to dry as quickly as possible to decrease the period of time that they're susceptible to infection from some of these diseases that I'll talk about. But canopy management also improves sunlight penetration and spray penetration. So when you've done all of the cultural practices that you can, and you may still see some diseases, in fact, very likely you would still see some diseases, but hopefully, if you've done everything you can culturally, you can manage those diseases with some of the organic pesticides that we do have. But if you're not practicing proper canopy management, that fungicide will not be able to penetrate into the canopy, and so it won't be able to access the leaves and the fruit the way it needs to, and you won't be able to get good protection from it. Finally, sanitation. This is the cleaning of the vineyard, and the goal here is simply to reduce disease pressure. The more of that pathogen inoculum or spores that you can get out of the field, the better off you're going to be. So that includes things like removing leaf litter, removing mummy berries, and things like that to try to get rid of as much of the pathogen inoculum from overwintering in the vineyard as you possibly can. I mentioned pesticides earlier. There are organic pesticides, and they are used routinely in organic agriculture and grape production in particular. But as I mentioned, this is one part of an integrated disease management program. If a grower simply thinks they can spray fungicides on a weekly basis and sort of ignore cultural practices and have a good crop at the end of the season, it's very unlikely here in Tennessee. And so, as I mentioned, the focus needs to be on those cultural practices. Organic pesticides alone are not going to be enough to manage most of these diseases. But if you do practice diligent cultural maintenance and timely pesticide applications, you can probably produce a pretty good crop here in Tennessee. Now, one thing to keep in mind about organic pesticides for grape management in particular is that some grape varieties are very sensitive to copper and or sulfur applications, and they can experience phytotoxicity or damage simply from the application of those products. There is varietal differences to their sensitivity to these chemicals, and I provided some resources at the end of the session here that if you want to pause the video, you can check those out. Some really good resources from both Ohio State and Cornell University, where they've compiled lists of some of the more common cultivars that you'd expect to grow and their relative susceptibility to both important diseases that we would expect to see, but also their susceptibility to damage from copper and sulfur. And so those are really important things to keep in mind, because if you choose a variety that is very susceptible to disease and very susceptible to damage from copper and or sulfur, you're probably going to have a very difficult time growing that variety organically here in Tennessee, because your management options will be very limited and you will need to manage diseases because you would expect to see them in a susceptible variety. Getting a little more detail into some of these cultural practices. Now, this is a relatively short talk, and I can't go into a lot of detail on any one of these topics. So I strongly encourage you to check out the resources that I've listed at the end of the session to learn more about any one of these particular issues. This is particularly true if you are establishing a vineyard, but you haven't done so yet. It's very important to become very familiar with these resources and to make sure you understand the nuances of growing grapes in Tennessee and the different cultural practices that you can do to be successful. Site selection. You want to plant on a slope, avoid low-lying areas. So again, the idea here is to encourage air drainage and encourage rapid drying of the foliage. Grapes, of course, need full sun, and so you wouldn't want to be in close proximity to anything that would be shading the crop. And you also want to avoid close proximity to wooded areas. And there's really two main reasons for this. One, they can simply restrict airflow, and so you can get some of that stagnant, humid air if you're near a wooded area, which again is going to create a favorable microclimate for diseases. But also, wooded areas can harbor diseases and pests potentially, and so some of those can move into the vineyard, and that's going to cause more problems for you too. So those areas should be avoided for establishing a vineyard. Number two, variety selection. As I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of variability and susceptibility to several of the important diseases that we see in Tennessee. And so certainly from an organic production standpoint, you want to try to choose varieties that are less susceptible to some of the more important diseases that we see here. Generally speaking, American grapes will be less susceptible to quite a few diseases that we have here in the US and North America, because in some cases they've co-evolved with the pathogens. And so they've kind of, over a long period of time, been able to sort of develop more resistance to some of the pathogens that we see, like Downy mildew, for example. French-American hybrids, again, those hybrids can sometimes have less susceptibility because they have some of that, those American-type genetics in them. Muscadines tend to be a bit less susceptible to some important diseases that we see, and they can be a good choice for Tennessee production. Typically, European varieties, Vitis vinifera, they tend to be quite susceptible to most of the important diseases that we have here. And so, obviously, there are many considerations for choosing varieties, depending on what they'll be used for, fresh market, wine production, whatever the case. But just strictly from a disease management standpoint, it's probably a good idea to at least consider some of these other species or cultivars that are less susceptible to some important diseases that we have here. Number 3, I mentioned earlier, canopy management. The goal here, again, to encourage air movement, sunlight, and spray penetration, and to get the foliage and the berries to dry as quickly as possible. There's really 2 main things we're talking about here. That's pruning and training. Pruning is the removal of plant parts, and hopefully that should be done annually. But also training, that's the development of the sort of framework for the vine on the trellis. And you can see a figure here from Professor Lockwood in our here at UTIA with Extension. I've linked his Extension publication at the end of the session, PB 1475. That's a really good resource for general grape production here in Tennessee. So all these cultural practices are discussed in there. He goes into a lot of detail on training and pruning and things like that. So I encourage you to become familiar with that. There isn't a lot of specific disease management information in there, but some of those other resources I've included at the end do have really good disease management information. But both pruning and training will impact air movement, sun exposure, and spray penetration, so they need to be given careful consideration. Finally, sanitation, sort of the 4th, but equally important cultural practice that should be considered. This is the removal of leaf litter, mummified fruit, and pruning debris with the goal of reducing disease pressure. The reason this reduces disease pressure, I mentioned this earlier, is several of the important disease-causing pathogens that we have in Tennessee can overwinter in this plant material. And so if it's left in the vineyard, either mummified fruit on the vine or fallen to the vineyard floor, it will overwinter, and then in the spring, the pathogens in that plant material will sort of emerge and release spores and cause disease again the following spring. The more of that you leave behind, the more the stronger your disease pressure is right at the beginning of the season. And if you start the season at a high level of disease, by the time you get to the end of the season, near harvest, sometimes diseases can be simply unmanageable. And so that's why it's very important to limit disease severity at the beginning of the season. And this is one of the best ways to do that. So now I'm going to talk about just a couple of the most common and most important diseases that you would expect to see growing grapes here in Tennessee, and talk a little bit about how to manage these and how the cultural practices impact these diseases in particular. The first is downy mildew. This disease is caused by an oomycete or a water mold called Plasmopara viticola. This can really cause severe disease in warm, humid climates like we have here in Tennessee. So we do see some pretty bad outbreaks of this usually every year, and it can really destroy a crop if left unmanaged. Another problem with it is if left unmanaged, it can weaken the vines and make them more susceptible to winter injury. So here you can see some symptoms of downy mildew on leaves. Initially, it might just start as sort of pale, yellow, maybe circular leaf lesions, and then as the disease progresses, the lesions will become brown or necrotic. They may be angular in appearance, kind of bound by the leaf veins. If you turn the leaf over, you can see sort of a white, powdery sporulation on the leaf underside. There's another disease called powdery mildew, which might look similar in some cases, but very often you'll see that powdery mildew on the upper leaf surface as well, whereas downy tends to be on the lower leaf surface. Species selection is very important for downy mildew management, and this is a difficult disease to manage. And so if you're in an area where you have a very favorable environment for downy mildew, you're having a hard time managing it, maybe you're not in an ideal location for your vineyard, choosing less susceptible varieties would probably be very beneficial in those cases. And you can see some of that listed here. Again, some of those resources at the end of the talk, if you check those out, you'll see tables where varieties are given sort of a relative susceptibility to downy mildew. And so those are really good resources for choosing varieties. Cultural practices to manage downy mildew. This disease is worse under wet and humid conditions. So anything that can be done to dry the leaves as quickly as possible is going to help manage downy mildew. Site selection, that needs to be done before the grapes grow in the ground. But again, careful site selection can make your ability to manage downy mildew that much easier throughout the life of the vineyard. So it is important. Canopy management, again, keep those leaves as dry as possible. Destroy or remove fallen leaves. So sanitation is important. This is one of those diseases that can overwinter right in the vineyard. So if you leave that plant material on the vineyard floor, you're going to leave a lot of spores to come up the following spring and start disease early, and it's going to start strong, and it's going to be hard to manage. So sanitation is crucial for this one. Copper fungicides may provide some control, but really that's a last resort. Once you've done everything you can culturally, start to see some downy mildew picking up in the vineyard, that's when it's time to think about those copper fungicides. But it certainly is not a silver bullet. Black rot. This is another very important fungal disease that's favored by warm and humid weather again. So we tend to have very favorable conditions for it here in Tennessee. And if left unmanaged, it can cause very serious losses. You can see the fruit there affected by black rot in this image. So not only do you get these fruit symptoms, you also get foliar symptoms. You can see these lesions on the leaf. They're quite distinctive looking. They're fairly easy to identify. They have this sort of light center with this darker ring around that. And then if you look carefully on the inside of those lesions, you can see the spore structures called pycnidia. That's where the spores are being developed and being released and causing the disease to spread within the season. Fruit symptoms, again, pretty distinctive looking. You get this small cream-colored dot, which is surrounded by a dark area. That's how they start, and eventually they will mummify that fruit, and they can even destroy entire bunches of grapes, and then you'll have these mummified fruit. And again, if you were to leave those mummified fruit on the vine over winter, or if they fall to the ground and they're left there, that's where a lot of these spores are going to come from the following season to regenerate black rot disease the next season. And so sanitation is really important for this one. Absolutely crucial. We can get some really bad black rot in Tennessee. So absolutely should not be overlooked, the sanitation for this one. Mulching the vineyard floor can help reduce some spore dispersal. So there's a good chance you're not going to get every single mummified fruit. You need to do the absolute best you can, but mulching can physically cover up some of those mummified fruit and kind of release or prevent some of the spores from being released, potentially. Copper is really the best fungicide for this, the best organic fungicide, that is. And it really should be used from bloom to about 6 weeks post-bloom to protect the berries. That's sort of a critical window for protecting berries from infection for this disease. A couple of other diseases just to be aware of. Phomopsis can be pretty common. You can get a cane blight or a leaf spot on that one. Powdery mildew, you can see the image there. That can affect the foliage and the fruit directly, as can downy mildew. And so they really need to be managed. You don't want to leave those unmanaged. And botrytis can be really a big problem too, and this can affect the bunches directly and rot them. So again, you want to make sure you're practicing sanitation. A couple of other diseases. You can see some images here: bitter rot, ripe rot, Pierce's disease, anthracnose. I'm just pointing these out as sort of a reminder that although there are a handful of diseases that if you're growing grapes in Tennessee, you can certainly expect to see and you will need to manage, there are a number of other diseases that can impact grapes, including a number of important viruses that I didn't touch on. And so I just mentioned this because if you're getting into growing grapes, make sure you're in contact with your county extension agent. They're a great resource, a local resource for helping identify which diseases or pests you're experiencing. If they don't know necessarily, you can also get in touch with the UT Soil Plant and Pest Center in Nashville. They have a new diagnostician up there, but that's an excellent resource for helping to identify what the problem is. But hopefully, if you're practicing those cultural practices that I talked about earlier, you will lessen the severity of any of these problems. But they still may come up, and it's important to make sure they're diagnosed correctly so that a management plan can be put in place that will be effective. I talked about a number of these resources as being very important. The first one, publication PB 1475, Dr. Dave Lockwood, who has lots and lots of experience with grape production in Tennessee and the Southeast, is the primary author on that one. That's a great resource for just growing grapes in general in Tennessee. A couple of the more disease management specific publications that I mentioned, the Ohio State University has an organic small fruit disease management guide, and you can see the URLs for those if you can pause the video and check those out. Or Cornell University also has an organic production and IPM guide for grapes, and you can see the URL for that there. Again, whether you're just thinking about establishing an organic vineyard, or if you've been doing this already, or you're maybe thinking about transitioning to organic, these are really important tools for understanding how to really do this successfully, because it will be challenging in Tennessee, but it can be done. You shouldn't be discouraged by the number of diseases that we have. It can be managed, but it does take some careful care and planning. There's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about any of the content that I discussed in today's session. And thank you for your attention.